begin. So let us begin. On behalf of everyone at Elliott Bay Book Company, my colleague Karen, who is doing all the behind the scenes work, although you will see and hear from her at the end. We at Elliott Bay Book Company, which is here on Duwamish land in the city of Seattle, are delighted you're here with us tonight. We are delighted, thrilled, and honored to be helping continue the publication celebration of Daniel James Brown's extraordinary new book, Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II. It's a book that had a national launch, which we were grateful to be part of last Tuesday, which actually was the day the book came out. And Dan and Tom Ikeda, who will be part of this tonight, did this wonderful program that was gave a overview and stories from this extraordinary book. And tonight, 6 days later, we're delighted to be continuing the publication celebration, doing something more particular and focused. And Dan and Tom will be joined by Lori Matsukawa, who actually will take over and make the program really go here shortly. Well, she's very adept at this. Lori's done this wonderfully and graciously before. As they talk about this book that Daniel James Brown has done. James Brown, of course, has done a series of books versed and rooted in really deep research, which his first 3 books, In Different Stars Above, Under a Flaming Sky, and the book he's most known for before this, Boys in the Boat, the story of the 1936 rowing team from the University of Washington, which became a worldwide sensation. But this book also has taken years of work and research to tell the story of this regiment of Japanese American soldiers, the 442nd, who fought in World War II under very unique and extraordinary circumstances. And it's a book that, as you see the book, as many of you are beginning to see the book, is indebted to many people. And certainly Tom Ikeda, who's the executive director of Densho, who has for over 25 years been doing a lot of vital work to keep stories alive as a generation was passing, not only in age, but also to get people who don't always talk about things to talk. Traumatic times, being in wars, being through the incarceration of World War II, and that effort, which is, there have been a number of books and authors addressing that. And Facing the Mountain is a book that really does some particular things. It's about the regiment of soldiers, but it's also about their families and what was going on in this country as well as the larger world. So Dan will and Tom will be talking, as I think in a different way, but similar to what they did a week ago. I think there have been some people who are among you who were here last week for their launch, and I think they have some other parts of the stories to talk about tonight. And Tom, as I say, is the executive director of Densho, which Karen has links to if she hasn't, a nonprofit organization that's totally important and central to not only life here in Seattle, but I think a larger part of this country's social and historic knowledge. And Lori Matsukawa, who is a great pleasure to have her back in this role again, known to many of you as for her many years, over 35, as an anchor and reporter at King. And what isn't always as known as evident from that role is all the work she's done also behind the scenes for years, supporting other journalists, other stories, other work. And she has been honored in numerous ways. She's twice won Emmy Awards for her work as a journalist, but she's also, for her larger work, received the Northwest Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Silver Circle Award. The Northwest Asian Weekly Foundation named her an Asian American Living Pioneer. And she, who actually helped found the Asian American Journalists Association, a national group, in 1985, received their Lifetime Achievement Award. And maybe most recently, she's been named a Japanese American of the Biennium by the National Japanese American Citizens League. And she has long interest in this story, coming from Hawaii, which is a big part of this book as well. Anyway, I'm saying all this, you will get to hear These three wonderful people, Daniel James Brown, Tom Ikeda, and Lori Matsukawa, they will take this over. I will remove myself, but please do, besides the wonderful comments in the chat, which continue with, do put questions. After a while, as they go through this, Lori will take questions, and if you would put them in the Q&A portal, which is on the bottom of most screens, it'll be easier for her to see the questions, and she'll ask them to Dan and Tom. And Judy Yu says, yes, one of the finalist jurors in the country and a role model for many. We'll put that as the final words here. So thank you again for being with us. And now please join in giving a good virtual welcome and warm attention to Daniel James Brown, Tom Ikeda, and Lori Matsukawa. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rick. Appreciate that fine introduction, and happy Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month to everybody out there. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's my great pleasure to be speaking with Daniel and Tom. I have had the pleasure of pre-reading this book, and if you haven't yet read it, you are in for a treat. Dan, let's start with you. Briefly describe the book for viewers who have no idea what it is. Briefly describe the book and how you decided to write it.
Yeah, well, let me start with how I decided to write it. It relates very directly to Tom. I think it was in whoops. What we did. I was talking about the boys in the boat. Tom was talking about his work at Densho. And I was sat there on the stage listening to Tom talk about his work, collecting Japanese American stories. And so I was interested. I got talking to Tom. I went home, I think it was that evening, and I started delving into this vast trove of oral histories that he has recorded and made available on the Densho site. And as I was viewing these and listening to them, I was just blown away by some of them. I'm a person that's all about story. And I was hearing these wonderful stories, and they were the kinds of stories that I'm really drawn to. They were stories, obviously, all about Japanese Americans, but they were also stories of ordinary people confronting and overcoming very difficult circumstances and pulling together to get through hard times. And so, as I say, that's the kind of thing that I'm drawn to. So I became more or less obsessed, and I started talking to Tom, and he and I went back and forth talking about some of these stories. And over time, what emerged is this book that is really, it's not an attempt at writing a comprehensive history of Japanese Americans. That would be really presumptuous, for one thing, of me to do that. But it is a story about several individuals. And what I'm always trying to do with The Boys in the Boat or a book like this is I'm trying to tell personal stories that shed new light on some part of history that perhaps people don't know a great deal about. So it's a book that weaves together a number of personal stories and really talks about the experiences of immigrants coming to this country from Japan, their experience trying to make a life in Hawaii or on the West Coast, their experiences during the war, and then in the camps, of course, coming home from the camps, coming home from the war. So the span is large. It covers many, many years, but the focus is very particular on a fairly small number of people.
So Tom, you are always visited at Densho by scholars, documentary makers, filmmakers, other researchers, but your relationship with Daniel was very deep. Tell me why.
Good question, Lori. It started with The Boys in the Boat. I mean, I am a big fan of that book, and I read this before I actually met Dan, And I'm a University of Washington alumni, and so the story of the crew team really resonated with me. But more than just the story, for the last 25 years, I'm a public historian, so I'm a really history nerd. And so this combination of Dan's storytelling and nonfiction, and combining the two was such a powerful combination for me. And as Dan mentioned, Densho has all these oral histories. I've conducted over 250 of them, and so I knew that there were so many, as Lori, as you know, incredible stories in our community, and so I was kind of tickled and kind of I guess really curious to see what Dan would be able to do with these stories. And as Dan mentioned, we went back and forth because initially, I was tickled that he was interested in Japanese American history. So I showed him some of the transcripts, some of the videos. But then it was because Dan did so much work, so much research. I mean, he dived into the stories. And so pretty soon we're just talking back and forth, kind of tackling questions. And Lori, I know you can appreciate this. How do you tell this story? It's so big. And you have the Hawaii story, you have the mainland story, you have resistors, you have the men who served, and it was a real kind of treat just going back and forth with Dan, who had already dived into the research, to have these discussions. And so in some ways I feel like it was very I'm not sure, organic in terms of what we did, that we started off, like you said, I oftentimes help authors and filmmakers and I tell them about stories. But when he came back with more questions and more information, we just started continuing it and going deeper and deeper. And I have to say, it's been one of the most rewarding times of my time at Densho, being able to do this. So this has been special.
So you mentioned you yourself have done 250 interviews. Other people on the staff and other volunteers have done additional interviews. Dan, how do you choose 4 characters out of so many very compelling stories?
That was very much the challenge, Lori. And I wrestled with it with Tom.
Okay, we're having a little bit of audio. Okay, there you go. Now you're back. Oh, maybe not.
When I come back.
There you go. Now you're back.
Okay, we'll try again. What I wound up doing was I realized that immediately after Pearl Harbor, young Japanese American men of draft age faced a particular dilemma. I mean, Japanese Americans in general faced a dilemma, but young draft age men, here they were, their families and themselves, they were being incarcerated, they were being forced from their homes, they were having to walk away from businesses and their schooling, they were having to sell their possessions for pennies on a dollar. At the same time, like a lot of other young American men, many of them wanted to do something in the face of the war that was breaking out. So what were they to do? This was a sort of a central dilemma that they faced, and dilemma is always good for storytelling. So I decided to focus on what wound up being 4 Nisei second generation men, all of whom came up against this one central problem. 3 of them wound up serving in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and one was a resistor. But it's also very much the story of their families, as I said, their immigrant parents, their mothers and sisters, and all the people who they loved, and how these decisions affected them. And I also, frankly, I had to pick people whose stories intersected at certain points along the timeline so that the story would be coherent. So it was a challenge, but I think I found the right 4 people.
It is quite amazing that you did. Tom, one of those people that Dan mentioned was Gordon Hirabayashi, who was the resistor of the 4. He was a student at the University of Washington who challenged the curfew executive order And his case was one of the several that went up to the US Supreme Court. Why was it important to include someone who was not a soldier in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team?
You know, when Dan and I were talking about the stories, and we start looking at the men who served in the military, you know, they exhibited this incredible courage in the face of enemy fire, and all the things they had to do to train and to even convince their families that they should fight. In the case of Gordon, he exhibited a different type of courage, which you know, I always found, you know, when I think about the men who defied, and the individuals, you know, men and women who defied the government during World War II, there was always a special place in my heart for Gordon, because at a very early place, he thought it through and knew what he wanted to do. I think, you know, some of the other people who ended up defying the government, they did it as more of an evolution, where Gordon right away kind of knew that what was happening to the community was wrong. And so more than, you know, I think more than a resistor, you know, Gordon you know, thought about what was happening in terms of what the government was trying to do, first with a curfew and then the exclusion order. The exclusion order being that you know, military commander down in the Presidio in San Francisco designated, you know, the western part of the continental US as an exclusion zone. And then with that said, anyone of Japanese ancestry had to be excluded from that. And Gordon right away said, you know, this isn't right. You know, he's a US citizen. You know, he was, as you mentioned, a University of Washington student. Yeah, he was like a Boy Scout. I mean, he was, you know, really good in school. And he just said, this isn't right. But more than just saying that, he, as you mentioned, he took his case all the way to Supreme Court and did it with such principle. And he was such an idealist too, because he, I remember when I interviewed him, he was surprised he didn't win. Even though I think when we look at the times and what was going on, you know, it probably was a case that would be very, very difficult to win. But he was such a principled, idealistic person that it was someone that I really fell in love with. You know, I'm so glad that, you know, Dan selected him to you know, be part of the story, because I think Gordon's story, his persistence, his principle stand, really kind of, I think, provides a balance to the overall story. You know, early on, I remember talking to Dan, I said, because he was looking for like one family. And I remember earlier thinking about the Hirabayashi family, because, you know, Gordon had cousins that were in the military, did MIS. I said, well, maybe that story, but then I said, wow, there's about 12 other families that should be in this also. So he really had to narrow it down. So it's really an amazing job.
We like to, at this coming out of after the war and post-war, we like to see the 442nd, the 100th Battalion as, you know, a cohesive, tight-knit group, but it didn't start out that way. You know, the guys from Hawaii did not get along with the guys on the mainland. So can you tell us a little bit about that, Daniel?
Yeah, to put it mildly, you know, when when the guys from Hawaii and the guys from the mainland wound up at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, which is where they were all sent, the 442 guys were all sent to for basic training. Fist fights broke out almost immediately, and they went on for weeks and for months. The two groups had a terrible time getting along. And there were a lot of reasons for that. But basically it had to do with the different kinds of backgrounds. The guys from Hawaii, many of them had grown up, their parents often had worked on sugarcane and pineapple plantations. Some of them also worked on plantations. They grew up in this multicultural sort of mix that Hawaii is. And they universally spoke Pidgin English, the Hawaiian Creole. And so they had a certain set of values and attitudes towards life, one of which was to enjoy life a lot. And on the other hand, the guys from the mainland mostly had grown up, and some of them had grown up on farms, but many of them had grown up in suburban environments or small town environments. And their upbringings were sort of more typically middle-class American upbringings. A lot of them were college bound. Some of them were already at, UCLA or wherever when the war broke out. So sort of a different set of attitudes. So there were those fundamental underlying problems. The language was a big problem. The mainland guys just literally couldn't understand the pidgin, the guys from Hawaii. The guys from Hawaii felt disrespected when the guys from the mainland couldn't understand what they were saying. And so that set off all kinds of fireworks. And the situation was so bad that the 442's commanders were considering just giving up on the idea and disbanding the 442 entirely. And it was actually one of the chaplains.
Oh, wait, stop. We've lost audio again. We'll just take a pause. Okay, try it again. No, not yet. Okay, try it again.
Okay, and how about now? I'm back.
There we go.
All
You're
right.
back.
So things were not going well. One of the chaplains for the 442 got the idea. He realized that the guys from Hawaii hardly knew about the concentration camps. They did not really understand. Some of the mainland guys had come out of the camps to volunteer, and they were angry, and they had a point to prove, and this was very serious business for them. The guys from Hawaii tended not to understand that. So what they did was, as I say, it was one of the chaplain's ideas. They started putting the guys from Hawaii on buses, and they took them to, there were 2 camps in Arkansas. And they took busload after busload of the guys from Hawaii to these concentration camps in Arkansas. And when the Hawaii guys saw all these people behind barbed wire and were themselves frisked, even though they were in US Army uniforms, frisked before they were allowed to go into the camps, they were horrified. And they began to understand why the mainland guys were so serious and sort of had a chip on their shoulder, or at least were righteously angry, I should say, about the situation. So that began the healing process. And over time, of course, they became an incredibly cohesive and effective fighting force.
I mean, they had to depend on one another. So out in the field, it was life or death, watch your back, watch your buddy's back.
Absolutely. And like all soldiers, they learned that in especially the first few weeks in Italy, which is where they first saw combat. It didn't take long for them to understand that their lives literally depended on the guy next to them on either side, whether he was from Hawaii or from Los Angeles.
So Tom, you heard about these stories between the fights between the Buddha heads and the Kotonks, and have heard several of the stories, including one from Shiro Kashino.
Yeah, I mean, the story I want to tell about Shiro actually gets to the heart of what Dan's talking about too, in terms of, the respect that would rise between the men, and his story about the Hawaii boys, learning about the concentration camps and understanding more about what the mainlanders had gone through. But for the mainlander side, they also had to gain respect for the Hawaii boys. And one way was how tough some of the Hawaii guys were. And so the story about Shiro Kashino, so Shiro was a Seattle kid who went to Garfield High School. He was the quarterback of the Garfield football team. I think he was actually all-city also. He was quite the stud. Shiro was quite large for Japanese American. I think he was close to 6 feet tall. And he was a tough kid too. He would get in fights. He was an orphan, and so would also get in fights. And so during training camp, we went to Camp Shelby and met with the Hawaii guys. Shiro kind of was taller, like a head taller than most of the other guys, and he was a little cocky too. And so I remember early on, there was some kind of exercise where they were doing like hand-to-hand combat. and Shiro jumped up, to volunteer. And another Hawaii guy volunteer who was probably about 5'3", 5'4". But this other guy knew judo. And so they got into a tussle and the guy just threw Shiro and pinned him to the ground. And at that point, Shiro looked at the Japanese American Hawaii's differently. He said, "Oh, these guys are tough," and they got his respect. And I know for the Seattle boys who were in training camp, they looked up to Shiro, and when Shiro said, "Hey, these guys are good," that meant a lot to them. So I think you saw that on both sides in terms of this this respect growing over time.
I think one thing, oh, go ahead, Dan.
I just wanted to add another little anecdote that sort of goes to that. Shortly before the 442 shipped out to Europe, there was a dance held near the base, and they brought a bunch of local girls. I think this was in Virginia, to provide dance partners for the soldiers. And so the 442 guys were dancing with all these young women. Most of them were white women. And some of the white soldiers from the base started drifting in, and they didn't really like what was going on. They didn't like that the Japanese American guys were dancing with all these white girls. And eventually a fight broke out. People started cutting in on other people, and pretty soon punches were thrown. And what was amazing was the entire 442 descended on that dance hall, Hawaii guys and mainland guys together. And they, at that point, they didn't care whether they were Buddha heads or Katonks. They were all about, being together, a band of brothers. And a lot of them knew martial arts.
Okay, so your audio has just cut out, Dan, but while you're recovering, I'm going to just toss in too, there's a part of your book where you talk about how they treated the African-American driver of their bus, or there was an African-American soldier accompanying this crowd on the bus. And the bus driver said to this African-American soldier, "Buddy, you have to enter the bus in the back door." And this totally outraged the guys from Hawaii for sure. And the 442 guys also. And the Hawaii guys basically drugged the bus driver out of the bus, kind of beat him up, and told the African-American soldier, "Get up into that front door." And I think the Hawaii soldiers actually drove the bus back to camp.
Yeah.
And it was just another example of how, they just could not stomach any more racial prejudice, and they wouldn't stand for it. Of course, they got in trouble, right, when they finally got up the next morning and said,
Yes.
"Yeah, we beat up the bus driver."
Yeah,
But
they wound up in the stockade. But yes, it was one of those bonding moments
yeah.
where they all came together, and this all served them well, because as I say, this happened just as they were getting ready to go into combat.
Okay. Crazy story. Okay. Also, Dan, you were one of the few you were able to actually interview Fred Shiosaki from Spokane, in person. Everyone else had kind of pretty much passed away, but you were able to actually talk to Fred. What was that like?
Yeah, I was building on what Tom had done. Tom had also interviewed Fred. But Fred was, of the four guys I write about, Fred was the only one who was still alive when I was starting work. So I was able to spend quite a bit of time with Fred. He grew up in Hilliard, which is a neighborhood in Spokane, down by the railroad yards, and a pretty tough neighborhood. It was mostly immigrants from all over the place. And because of that, a lot of racial slurs got thrown around. And Fred, although he was really basically a pretty soft-spoken guy, he would not abide racial slurs. And so he got in a lot of fistfights. His father had to keep, they ran a laundry, the Hilliard Laundry. They lived over the laundry. His father had to keep buying Fred new eyeglasses because he was constantly getting in these fights. So, he was a guy who didn't really want to fight, but he definitely knew how to fight. And I think that served him well. He attempted to enlist this.
Okay, we've got an audio issue. While we're waiting, let's go to Tom. Anything else that you wanted to maybe include about talking about Fred?
Well, I think, Fred, for me, when I interviewed him, was so able to uh, be vulnerable, share his feelings. And, his nickname when he was growing up and with the 442 guys was Rosie, because his cheeks would always get red when he got angry or embarrassed, and really showed his emotions. And so Fred wasn't afraid to show anger or doubt when I interviewed him. And sometimes when you're interviewing veterans, they don't do that. They don't really share kind of their feelings about what was going on. And I remember there's one scene that Dan captured really well that struck me was it was actually a point where he was bringing a prisoner of war, a German prisoner of war, back to headquarters, and he was with another 442 soldier who had just lost. His brother had just been killed, in some ways murdered. His brother was a medic, and he was on the field, and a German soldier just cold-bloodedly shot his brother. And so Fred was just so upset. And here he's bringing the grieving brother back to headquarters too, because he was so struck. And then a prisoner of war. And Fred was so angry, and he talked about this. He was so angry he wanted to shoot the German POW, and he didn't. But he questioned. He said, "You know what? I was so angry. I could so easily have done that." And he recognized how much the war had changed him as a man, that he would even consider shooting someone in cold blood. But that's what war would do to him. But he was so, I guess, relieved, though, the war hadn't changed him so much that he did it. But he was willing to share those kind of, those thoughts, which I so appreciated.
So Dan, anything else to add on Fred?
Yeah, I mean, that's the essence of Fred. I should add also that Fred, like a lot of these guys, when he came home from the war, he brought a lot of psychological wounds as well as physical wounds home. He moved back into the apartment over the laundry after the war. And for weeks and months after that, his mother had to wake him up in the middle of the night because he was screaming. He was having nightmares. He obviously had PTSD, but he was a remarkable man, and I was just so honored to be able to spend some time in his presence. When I first met him, I walked into the retirement home where he was living, and I stuck out my hand and I said, "I'm so honored to meet you, sir." And he said, "Oh, no, I'm so honored to meet you." And it was so.
Oh no. Okay. Oh no. Hang on to that thought. Hang on to that thought. Wait, hang on. Okay, now go.
I'm not sure where I lost the sound, but I'll just sum up by saying Fred was just one of the nicest and most honorable guys I've ever met.
I'm going to have you read a little excerpt from your book, Daniel, but in a moment. But I do remember that throughout the book, what brought these soldiers together was their Japanese heritage. It was important because there are concepts in the culture like giri, loyalty. So many of them, whether they were from the mainland or from Hawaii, were told, don't bring shame to your family. That was the last, if you have to get shot, get shot. If you have to die, die, but don't bring shame upon the family. And that seemed to be a common message and a point of commonality between these two groups of soldiers.
Absolutely. So I do have a passage to read, and I hope I can make it through with the audio continuing. If I fade out, raise your hand or something, and I'll pause until I come back. But I need to set this up a little bit. I was honored to be able to join a number of the sons and daughters of some Nisei vets on a tour of the battlefields of Europe where they fought. And one of the places we went was in Italy to a mountaintop, Monte Folgorito. And this is where the Nisei troops near the end of the war climbed up the backside of a mountain in the middle of the night, surprised the Germans at dawn, and broke through what was called the Gothic Line, this formidable German defensive position, and really opened up the Gothic Line for the rest of the Fifth Army to pour through. So it was an amazing achievement. So when we went there and I was at the top of this mountain, I had sort of an epiphany. And I just want to read you what was going through my head as I stood up there. I was looking down at a little village at the bottom of the valley. So I'll try this. When we finally clambered onto the summit, I stood for a moment just catching my breath. Then I looked around and I was stunned. Below me to the west, the mountain's green foothills tumbled down toward the brilliant turquoise expanse of the Ligurian Sea. To the southwest, I could see all the way to Livorno, to the north, all the way to the buff-colored cliffs of the Cinque Terre. To the northeast, the great spires of Monte Altissimo loomed above us like stony fangs. What really arrested my attention, though, was what lay between me and those peaks. A deep chasm, the abrupt sides cloaked in dark vegetation, dropping thousands of feet from where I stood at an angle of perhaps 60 degrees. At the bottom were the red tile roofs of houses in what looked like a toy village. The village was Azano, and it was out of that abyss that the Nisei soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had climbed in the middle of the night 75 years before, lugging their weapons, prepared to fight and if need be to die. Standing there, I struggled to comprehend the sheer audacity of it, pondering what exactly enabled those young men to do something like that. But in almost the same instant, I knew the answer. It was something simple and powerful and irreducible. It was who they were at their core. Those young men were the living embodiments of the spirit that has always animated America, the spirit that has held us together for more than 2 centuries, the striving, the yearning, the courage, the relentless optimism, the willingness to chip in and lend a hand, the fair-mindedness, the inclusiveness. They knew that they had been called upon to defend a set of simple but profound ideals, the highest ideals of America and the Western democracies. And having heard the call, they answered it, as did millions of young men in the first half of the 1940s. Most of them fought for those ideals on the battlefield. Some, like Gordon Hirabayashi, fought for them in courtrooms. But do not forget this: as American as they were in some ways and to varying degrees, they were also proudly Japanese. As they stood up and ran into the fire.
Stop. Time out, Dan. Time out, Dan. Hang on. Just a second. Just a pause. Okay, can you say something now? Can I hear you? Nope, not yet.
Not yet.
Now. Okay.
Do not forget this: as American as they were, in some ways and to varying degrees, they were also proudly Japanese. As they stood up and ran into the fire, many of them carried with them the values that their immigrant parents had taught them, not just the samurai code of Bushido, but a host of related beliefs and attitudes, Giri and ninja and gamin among them. It was indeed largely because they held those other foreign values that many of them were able to do what had to be done. On Monte Folgorito in the Vosges forest, among the hills of Tuscany, and Monte Cassino, time and again, they selflessly offered up their best selves. And the selves they offered up, the lives they put on the line, grew from both American and Japanese roots. Whether they lived or died in the endeavor, they reminded us yet again that we Americans are all compounded of varied stuff, forged together in the furnace of our national tribulations and triumphs. In the end, they helped win for us a better world, the one than the one in which they found themselves when Japanese bombers first appeared over Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Now, more than a generation later, it is up to us to cherish and protect what they won, to devote ourselves yet again to the principles they defended, to surmount our own mountain of troubles, to keep moving upward together on the long slope of our shared destiny. And I hope I made it through that.
Fabulous, fabulous. We're going to go to questions from the audience, and there are many, but this portion that you just read referred to the valley and the mountain. And so one viewer is wondering about the title, Facing the Mountain. What does it mean?
So I should credit my wife who came up with the title, Sharon.
Yep. Uh-oh. Okay, we've got a little audio blip. Okay. Okay, let's try it again. Here we go. Oh, nope, not quite yet. We have your video, but not your audio. We're getting there. We're halfway there. Okay, now we can hear you. Go ahead. Crediting your wife.
Yes, it was my wife's idea. It's really a bunch of things all in once. For one thing, these guys, it was just a physical fact that these guys were always fighting their way up the side of some mountain or another. That the reality was the Germans held the high ground in Italy, in France, and in Germany. So they were always having to fight uphill against odds, but also against the terrain. But more metaphorically, it to me means that, as I say, at the beginning of World War II, these young men.
Oh no. Oh no. Okay, hang on. All right. Okay. Do I hear you? No, I don't hear you yet. Okay. Well, I'm going to go on to a next question until okay. Oh, here you've come back. Okay, you're back. Here we go.
Just very quickly. To me, it's a metaphor for this sort of mountain of troubles that these young men and their families faced and had to overcome immediately after Pearl Harbor.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another viewer is asking, when we talked about the relationship between resistors and the people who were veterans who saw action in World War II, and maybe Tom, you can address this a bit. Is it similar to what was experienced by Vietnam vets who came home and faced resistors and protesters who were protesting the Vietnam War? What was the relationship like between those who fought in World War II and those who resisted?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, the similarity is there was a deep chasm between resistors and the men who served in the military, which I think is maybe similar to what happened during Vietnam War. But in terms of the public sentiment, it was, I think, different in that during World War II, 95% of the men went into the military, and the draft resistors were viewed as a smaller group, oftentimes ostracized by the community and the public. Versus, I think Vietnam, because of the anti-war protests, is actually in many ways the men who fought were oftentimes had more difficulties when they came back, especially in places like Seattle, I think. But going back in terms of the chasm, my father-in-law was a draft resistor. My father was a World War II vet. And so I could see both sides. And I know it was really hard for my father-in-law, who's a draft resistor. He served 3 years at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary for being a draft resistor. And when he came back to Seattle, the veterans did not treat him very well. I mean, they would do things like they would cross the street if they saw him coming to the other side, so they wouldn't be near him, or they would even there are instances where they would actually beat up draft resistors and make it hard for them. So it was a very difficult time in terms of the differences between the resistors and the Nisei veterans. And it's captured in an early novel called No No Boy that really looked at the friction between the draft resistors and the veterans. But almost to this day, it still causes tension within the Japanese American community between those who resisted during World War II and those who fought and served.
Right. Families don't socialize sometimes to
Yeah.
this day. A question maybe for Dan, in your research, how were the JA soldiers treated by their officers and other white soldiers? How did the white people react to JA soldiers?
Yeah, it was kind of a mixture. I mean, when they were at Fort Camp Shelby, the JA soldiers, they really liked their immediate, the commanders at Fort Shelby. And also, even in service, there was a Lieutenant Colonel Purcell they just universally admired a great deal. But that was far from universal. Most notoriously, there was a General Dahlquist, who frequently ordered them into situations that were unreasonable and which put their lives at unreasonable risk. And really, there's an incident at the heart of the book that I'll leave to readers. But Dahlquist mismanaged the situation terribly. Let's just say that's a too kind a way to put it. They loathed General Dahlquist. And for long after the war, could not abide being near him, actually. So it was a mixed thing. It depended on the quality of the leadership that their white officers demonstrated. They didn't have a lot of interaction after they left Shelby with white foot soldiers because it was an all Japanese American unit. So they didn't interact with other units very frequently.
What was it? Well, how were soldiers, viewers want to know, how were soldiers treated when they did come back? I mean, Japanese soldiers came back, white soldiers came back, African-American soldiers came back, but how were the JA soldiers treated by the general public?
So I couldn't hear the second part of the question, but I did hear the first part. When they came back, it was again very mixed. There were newsreels that celebrated what the 442 had done toward the end of the war. And so some people saw those and recognized what they had done, and they were to some extent treated as heroes. But for the most part, they came back into a racially stratified, segregated society, and they ran into the same kinds of discrimination that they had experienced before the war. So coming home was just the beginning of a long process of trying to make things better. As you may know, Lori, in Hawaii, the 442 vets, when they came back, a lot of them went to law school and earned law degrees and came back to Hawaii and sort of gradually began to wield a lot of influence in politics and in business and in all facets of governments in Hawaii. So they left Hawaii. It was a plantation system. When they came back, they were determined after what they had gone through to try to help transform Hawaii into a more modern society. And they were very successful in doing that.
Laura, I have one story I want to share in terms of the treatment, and it was actually one in terms of a Nisei soldier who was killed in action, and his body was returned to a small town in California, and in this town, in terms of Dan mentioned, in terms of this racially stratified, segregated era, the townspeople refused to let the family bury the soldier, this war hero in the town cemetery. When a top general in DC heard about this, he was livid. So he brought a whole contingent from Washington DC of military brass to give the soldier a full honored service. And the story is somewhat well known in Japanese American history because one of the people there was Ronald Reagan. He was I believe a lieutenant. He was in the army, And he, read a speech, and he remembered that because it came into play later on when he was president, because that was when the redress movement, when the government looked back at what had happened and realized they had made a mistake. And so the government, passed the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, and Reagan signed that. And when he signed the bill, in his speech, he talked about that incident, how horrible it was that this, Japanese American soldier wouldn't be buried by this town, and how he was there and he read his speech. But it just shows you how difficult it was for Japanese Americans, both dead and alive, to return to some of their communities.
I know that it did take a very long time for several of these JA soldiers to get their medals of honor. There was sort of like a mass recognition, if you will, of soldiers who had been overlooked, or kind of their nominations perhaps, kind of pushed to the side. I mean, it took a long time. I want to say in the 1990s before a whole batch of Japanese American soldiers received their medals of honor, including Daniel Inoue. And I wonder sometimes if their nominations or their honors were squelched because they were Japanese American. I don't know.
I think it's fair to say that they were. I mean, the sheer numbers of casualties that they took, the 442 took, tell you just how the kind of combat they saw, and also the conditions under which they fought, and the battles that we know, the battles that they won. It was clear from the time they came back that what they had done was extraordinary, far more than other units of the same size could possibly have done or had done during the war. And it took a long time for that to be fully recognized. So it was, I think, shameful that it took so long before those honors were bestowed.
Okay, we have another question. I want to know why there are no monuments built honoring the 442nd 100th Battalion in the United States. This viewer, Joan, says, I feel it's embarrassing because there are many such monuments to the 442 in Europe.
So Tom, you can probably address this more than I can, but I believe a monument does exist in Washington, D.C. now, the Golden Cranes Monument. Are you familiar with that?
I am, and that's actually more for the people who were in the 10 concentration camps.
Okay.
And so it's not a war memorial.
Okay.
So it's to acknowledge the what happened to the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated. I believe in I don't know my Japanese American Hawaii. But I believe there are things in Hawaii. Lori, are you familiar with it? Like at Fort DeRussy or something? I thought there was some.
I believe there is a small one near Fort DeRussy, but one of the viewers, Eileen Lamphere, is saying that there is the Go for Broke Memorial in Los Angeles. So Go for Broke is specifically, right? It's the rallying cry for the 442. So
right.
Yeah, that would be the closest we have to that.
Yeah. They actually have, when I think about LA, they have two. They have one that is a large one with has the names of all the men who served, and then another one in Little Tokyo that really focuses on the men who were killed in action. So yeah, there are memorials.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of our hour, and I'm wondering if there are any final comments you wanted to make, or things in the book that are sure to curl your hair and your toes. I mean, I couldn't put that book down, Daniel, because it was so personal, for one thing. I felt like I knew every character and their family. It was that intimate. And this was really the first time I actually read how Senator Inoue lost his arm. I had heard he lost his arm in the war, but I had never heard the details of it. And the way you described it was so vivid. So, I mean, it must have been kind of exhausting after a while, writing about so much carnage and suffering and sadness. What was it like, when you finally wrote the last word?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard, of course, because when you write something like that, you're immersing yourself in it, and you're obviously not experiencing it yourself, but it's the closest thing to it. And there was, there was a lot of suffering, a lot of carnage. The Inoue episode in particular was absolutely bone chilling. I also didn't know exactly how he had lost that arm, but it's not just that it was bone chilling, it was extraordinary valor. I mean, what he did that afternoon is just took my breath away from the standpoint of somebody trying to imagine himself in that situation, having that kind of courage. The things he did in sequence that afternoon, even with his arm severed, were just extraordinary. So I think, although it is hard to write about those things, a lot of it really is inspirational. I'm not a person who loves war or combat or anything like that. I don't believe in glorifying that kind of thing, but I do believe in paying respect to people who exhibit extraordinary courage. And there were a lot of episodes like that where you saw extraordinary courage.
There is a question from one viewer who we've talked about Gordon Hirabayashi, we've talked about Katz Miho, and we've talked about Fred Shiosaki. He wanted to know who the fourth person was.
The fourth person is Rudy Tokiwa, who grew up in Salinas, California on a farm. His family was incarcerated at the Poston concentration camp. And Rudy was one of the guys that volunteered out of the camp to enlist in the 42nd. He was a real character. He's very colorful. His army name was Punch Drunk. He got in trouble a lot. He he didn't always follow the rules, but he had just had this huge heart. And if you get a chance, if you go on either to Densho or on my website, danieljamesbrown.com, there's a thing called Beyond the Book, and in that section there are some clips of Tom's interviews with Rudy and other people. There's a clip of Rudy talking about all of the clips of Rudy talking about his war experience are really worth listening to. You'll see just how much heart he had.
You want to
Lori,
add anything?
Yeah, Lori, I want to just mention one thing. Dan wrote this book in the last, 5.5 years when our country was going through a lot of turmoil. In particular, as he wrote about things like, why Japanese Americans, were being placed in camps. It's kind of like this, in some ways, a lie in terms of, well, we need this for, back then they said military necessity. Japanese Americans were dangerous. When Dan was, starting to write this book, it was the time when the Muslim travel ban was being enacted, and the government was saying, well, we're doing this for national security. Muslims coming from these countries are dangerous, so we have to, stop it. The other thing that we saw was on the southern border, families were being detained and separated, reminiscent to what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. And while all this was happening, I could tell that impacted Dan, and I want him to say something about that because, when you read the book, you get really engrossed with the men that he writes about. There's such powerful stories about each one. But what I found was after I read the book and just sort of took a step back, the issues of racism and sometimes the ironies that the Japanese Americans, and Dan actually set this up. I mean, the fact that Japanese Americans helped liberate some of the death camps in Germany while their families were in concentration camps in the United States. I mean, all these things are there that makes you think about what's going on. And I think Dan did a really good job of also putting that out there. So it's more than just kind of stories about these men. He was really talking about America and who we are. And so Dan, I want you to say a little bit about this because I'm so impressed with that part too. And that I think is, for me, the power of your book also.
Yeah, I mean, it was impossible to ignore what was happening. Well, not that I wanted to ignore it, or maybe I did. As I was beginning to write the book was coincided with the beginning of the Trump administration. And so as I was reading about immigrant families from Japan trying to make their way in America, there was all this anti-immigrant rhetoric out there. As I was reading about families being torn apart in various ways by the incarcerations, families were being torn apart at the southern border, as you say. So throughout the whole process of writing it, there were all these echoes with what was happening, with what is happening. And it didn't really change the facts that I was writing about. The facts are the facts. I'm writing history. But it probably did cause me to pull some things more to the forefront than I might otherwise have, because it really became important to invite my readers, without explicitly saying so, inviting them to see the parallels between what happened then and what happens now. And my biggest hope for this book is that it opens hearts, that if people read about what these families I'm writing about, what they went through as immigrants, what they experienced during the war.
Wait. It'll come. It'll come. Okay. No, not yet. Not yet. Okay. I think I heard you breathe.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Your greatest hope.
My greatest hope is that this will open hearts, which is something actually Tom wrote also in the foreword, but it's the same sentiment I have. I think if people get to know these families, get to know these individuals, and understand the things that they went through, the things they sacrificed for this country, it's bound to help them appreciate not just as history, but as a reflection of what immigrants in general have done for America, and how toxic racism has been for our whole society, going back through this period and from long before this period. So that's my hope for the book.
All right. Well, our time is up. I'm going to invite Karen to join us again. Daniel James Brown, thank you so much. Tom Ikeda, thank you so much. Karen, take it away.
So I have to say thank you to all three of you. This has been an extraordinarily moving program. The book is amazing, as Lori has said, and as Tom has said. And I'm so honored that so many people were here today. I think we have members of the Inouye family, and also probably other family members of people who were in the book, or maybe they weren't in the book, but your families experienced some of this, your friends and your neighbors. They're really important stories. And if you haven't already encouraged your loved ones, your elders, to come and speak to Tom and company at Densho, please do. These stories existed because Densho and Tom had the foresight to maybe disregard his father, the advice from his dad to not make waves, and encourage people to tell the stories and have them preserved. It's amazing to listen to the stories of many of the people in the book, and also hundreds more. And so I want to say congratulations on 25th anniversary year for Densho, and may you have many more. There's some new programs that are coming out of Densho, a great blog, and also some interesting posts on Facebook, and a new podcast called Kampu. So you can see what the next generation of descendants are making of what's in the archive, and the wonderful stories that are preserved there. I also want to say thanks to everyone for supporting Elliott Bay Book Company. It's been quite a year. Just letting you know that we're open for in-store browsing. We also have mail order and also curbside pickup. If you ordered a copy of Dan's book, we're going to be putting it in the mail to you tomorrow, and they're signed, and we have many more signed copies. So if you haven't gotten one, please order from us. You can call us, you can drop by. So thanks so much. And yes, we have recorded this talk, so we'll be posting it. Yeah, I think it's really moving and wonderful to experience people talking about this project. And Thanks to Tom, to Lori, and of course to Daniel James Brown, and thanks to all who attended tonight. Good night.